This week on the show, we're loaded up with great stories ranging from system call fuzzing, a history of UNIX pipes, speeding up MySQL imports, and more. Stay tuned. BSD Now is coming your way right now. BSD Now, episode 166, Past That UNIX Pipe, recorded November 2nd, 2016. Hey, I'm your host, Chris Moore.
And I'm Alan Jude. And I also don't believe that title. Jesus.
Right? What's wrong with that?
That's fine.
I could have said Past the UNIX Peace Pipe or something. Like, you know, right? We're going to be talking about UNIX Pipe a little later, so for those who don't know, that's what's going on. Anywho, we got a good episode for you guys this week. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. Of course, next week, Alan and I will be out at Meet BSD, so we will still have something for you, though. So don't fret. We never leave you hanging. You always get a new episode.
That's 166 weeks in a row.
I know. Do we get an award or something at the? I don't know. How does this work? Anyway, this is pretty impressive. You know, even TV series take breaks or whatever, but no, we don't. So good stuff. All right, I know Alan's getting over a little bit of a cold, so we have limited vocal Alan available today. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So we'll let you go with the first story here, Alan. I guess some system call thing they were doing.
Right. So if you remember back earlier in the summer, we saw the NCC group doing syscall fuzzing and the abilities with that. But what we found on GitHub here is actually the tools they use to do it. So they have this thing called Triforce OpenBSD Fuzzer. And basically it's a combination of AFL, the American Fuzzy Lot program for fuzz testing regular programs, QEMU, and then their scripts here, the Triforce AFL. And then they use that on top of FlashRD, which is basically a distribution of OpenBSD meant to be written to a flash. It's kind of like MFS BSD for FreeBSD, but it's roughly equivalent kind of concept anyway. But basically, from their Linux box, they can run this fuzzer against OpenBSD running a QEMU so that they can inject all the various bits and see what happens. So say the requirement currently is that you need a Linux box to run as the host. They say other fuzzer hosts may work, but they've only tried it on Ubuntu. So it'll be interesting to see if somebody else can pick this up and see if they could actually run the OpenBSD fuzzer with QEMU on top of OpenBSD or some other BSD.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Then obviously the other possible outcome of this is, what if you wanted to say fuzz test FreeBSD using this? How much work would it be to change this around to make it fuzz all the syscalls in FreeBSD instead? So it'll be interesting to see what people could do with this now that the tools are up on GitHub.
Are you hinting, Alan? You have anybody specifically in mind?
I'm hoping somebody will do it.
Come on, somebody do it. There's definitely somebody out in the audience here has the time and some of the know-how to get this working. But yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay, well, good stuff. Well, thank you, Alan. So on to, I guess, what kind of inspired the title of this week's episode, which Alan chuckled at, was on the early history and impact of UNIX, the introduction of pipes. So, of course, pipes are something we just kind of take for granted today. They've always been around since I've been doing this, but there was a time before pipes, and I don't know how they got anything done back then. But we have Rhonda Haubin writes up a good look back at the beginnings of UNIX, specifically at how pipes are born. I just wanted to read you a little bit of some of the quotes from here. But one of the important developments in UNIX was the introduction of pipes. Pipes had been suggested by McElroy during the early days of creating UNIX. Ritchie explains how the idea, explained one afternoon on a blackboard, intrigued us, but failed to ignite any immediate action. Oh, shame on them. They should have done it right away. But they said there were several objections to the idea as put. He said, what a failure of imagination, he admits. McElroy concurs, describing how the initial efforts to add pipes to Unix occurred about the same time in 1969 that Ritchie, Thompson, and Kennedy were outlining ideas for a file system. That was when he writes, the simple pipeline is a way to combine programs with data notationally propagating along a chain of not necessarily concurrent filters was articulated. However, even though they talked about it then, it wasn't actually implemented until 1972. We also have a great quote from McElroy on the day pipes were first introduced. He says, "Open systems, our systems. How well those who were there remember the pipe-festooned garret where Unix took form. The excitement of creation drew people to work there amidst the whine of computers, cooling fans, even though almost the same computer access could be heard from one's office or from home. Those raw quarters saw a procession of memorable events. The advent of software pipes precipitated a day-long orgy of one-liners." I can imagine. It was like, what happens if I pipe this to that? Anyway, he goes on. As people reveled in the power of functional composition in the large, which even today unavailable to some users of other systems. Man, I imagine what a cool thing that was back in the day. They were like, what happens if I pipe this to that, or if I stream this that? Imagine all the bugs they found though. Oh, dude, like that doesn't work. That's amazing though. One of those things. I wish they had recorded that back in the day. That would have been.
It's interesting. When you invent this stuff, you think it's just small, doesn't really matter, and it turns out it's the fundamentally changes everything.
Definitely. But the paper here also goes into talk about the invention of some other important tools such as grep, and diff is mentioned as well. So definitely worth your time if you want a little bit of a glimpse into the history of Unix, which I didn't know that they actually were talked about in the 60s, late 60s, but even 72 is still really early. So the idea of a pipe has been around for, just about since the beginning of the computing age. That's amazing.
Yeah. But
this one I take it for granted today.
It says, Pipe said they attack the accidental difficulties that result from using individual programs together by providing integrated libraries, unified file formats, and pipes and filters. As a result, conceptual structures that in principle could always call, feed, and use one another can easily do so in practice.
So definitely a good article. It looks like it's part of a series. It's hosted over at harvard.edu. Yeah, so maybe we'll have to dig up the rest of those and see what other golden nuggets there are from the early days of Unix. But definitely good stuff, and check it out if you're interested in that kind of thing. That's definitely fascinating. Yeah. Okay, so before we get to the rest of our news, we're going to mention our first sponsor this week, which is going to be IX Systems. Of course, the website for that, ixsystems.com/BSDNow, where, of course, IX is powered by the latest and greatest Intel processors. They're one of their premier partners in that aspect, and they're really good about finding you whatever it is you need. So if you need some esoteric specific chip, because as Alan tried doing before, I need some transcoding done, they will help you find that, right? And of course, the nice thing about IX is when you call up, sure, they sell some standard things like the FreeNAS minis and certain TrueNAS boxes, but you really want to call up and tell them what you need, though. What are you going to be doing? What's the bare minimum level of performance you need to do X task? And because these guys know what they're doing, they can tell you, oh, well, you probably want this kind of SSD. Or don't worry about a ZIL. Or yes, you do want a ZIL. You'd want a faster ZIL. Or you know what? You need a lot more RAM in this case. So they just kind of speak that language. So, don't be afraid to tell them about your database or your mail server.
Just tell them what the problem is you're trying to solve with the server, and they can help you build it better than if you just say, I need a server with this much RAM and this many hard drives or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, and you want to tell them things like they're not going to get scared if you say, well, I have this many files and they're this size and this is the block size we want to use on the file system. Like that's the kind of data they need to help you have a good purchase experience, right? Because then they can fine tune and make sure, well, these drives in particular are going to perform much better. And if they're configured this way in like a RAID Z setup or in a RAID setup, they just know, they speak that language. It's kind of cool. It's different from talking to a sales guy at other companies where they're just going to be like, well, these are the 3 models we offer. Which one do you want? And hopefully it works for you. Oh, I don't have any idea what Postgres is.
Well, it also makes, like you were saying, it makes a big difference is so you need 30 terabytes of storage, but are you storing big, like 1 gigabyte files each, or are you storing like 4 billion tiny files? Because how you're going to want to deal with, how you're going to want to spend the same amount of money to get better performance for those 2 different workloads is going to be different. And they can help you work through that.
So definitely get in touch with them today. And, of course, tell them you heard about it here on BSD Now because they love hearing from our listeners. Okay, so next up we have speeding up MySQL imports on FreeBSD. I guess a blog post from Mark Felder. So what did he do, Alan? How is he accomplishing this?
So he basically was tasked with setting up some new MySQL servers, rebuilding the read-only slave database. And so he basically had an SQL dump of all the data from the database, and he wanted to import it. But when he was importing it, it was doing, like 10 megabytes a second. And it's like, well, this is a really large database dump. I can't afford for this to take 3 days to finish. So he started digging into it. And he says, I was recently tasked with rebuilding the read-only slave database server, which is only a slave coupled for the available database. The backup/dump is straightforward and fast, but the restore was excruciatingly slow. I didn't want to wait a week for this to finish, so I had to compile a list of optimizations that would speed up the process. This is the best way to do it on FreeBSD, assuming you're using InnoDB. Additional optimizations may be required if you're using a different database engine. It does say, please note, this is assuming no other databases are running on this MySQL instance, and some of these are rather dangerous, and you wouldn't want to put your live data at risk. Most of these changes are meant to be temporary. So you're meant to use them while you're importing and then turn those settings back to the defaults, once you're actually trying to use the database. So specifically what he did was he set sync bin log to 0, so that as it's updating the binary logs, it won't issue a sync asking ZFS or your UFS or whatever file system you're using to flush all the way to the disk. It'll allow it to build up. So because each individual insert is normally a transaction that's going to result in a sync, by doing this, you allow them to happen much faster because you don't have to stop and wait for the hard drive between each one. Especially, in ZFS, a sync is a more expensive operation because you're flushing a whole transaction group. Although, if that's where a ZIL can come in to do that to the SSD instead of the other hard drives or whatever. But even on SSDs, you will get a speed gain by disabling sync there.
Yeah, this is a big bulk import, though. You don't care about that necessarily.
So then to do it for the actual transactions, you have InnoDB flush log at transaction commit. Set that to 0, and it won't flush the logs either. So that'll your InnoDB logs and your binary log will both basically not do a sync now. That'll help. And then InnoDB double write, you can set that to 0, and it won't write the data to the log and then write it to the data file. The point there being that if the system crashes, it's in the log and you can replay it against the data file to get back to a consistent state. Of course, that's assuming you're using a file system that's not, say, ZFS, that is going to actually give you one state or the other instead of, a mixed state. But again, those are things you're going to want to turn back off. And he's got comments in his lines here. He's like, do not keep this permanently. And, use only during imports and so on. You can see he's got. But with those, he also prepends some settings to his, so he cats his dump.sql.gz and pipes it into a subshell running echo to insert a couple things at the top of the thing, and then into zcat, which will decompress the gzip and then pipe it into MySQL. But he's basically setting SQL log bin equals 0, set auto commit equals 0, set unique check equals 0, and set foreign key check equals 0. So this way, MySQL is not going to try to flush its logs. It's also not going to auto commit after each transaction. It'll just group them all up. And it will not bother with the uniqueness or foreign key checks because you're in bulk importing the data. You already know that it was consistent when you dumped it, and this will save a lot of time. He says now that that's done, instead of tens of megabytes imported per minute, he was getting several gigabytes imported per minute.
Oh, wow. So that's order of magnitude.
If you're using ZFS to back, the tips from now on are just my personal ones. If you are using MySQL InnoDB on ZFS, important things you can do is if you set the record size to 16K instead of the default 128, because that's the native record size in InnoDB, you'll get much better performance and avoid write amplification. Also, LZ4 is very useful on databases, but that's up to you. But the other setting in newer ZFS is redundant metadata equals most. Because you're writing such small blocks, just 16K, it doesn't make sense to write 3 copies of all the metadata at 4K apiece. Because that means that if you write a small database record, you could actually end up writing more metadata than actual data. So by setting redundant metadata to most instead of all, the default, you'll write less metadata with each of these writes. And, if you're doing 200 writes a second or 1,000 writes a second, that adds up really quickly. So setting will help your database performance. Although there's, keeping 2 copies instead of 3 copies of all the metadata is a slightly increased risk, but not that much. And hopefully on your database, you're using mirrors or something anyway. Then the next 2 settings you only want to set when doing the import, like the other stuff. But basically, if you do ZFS set sync equals disabled on the data set for the database, then even if the database asks for a sync, ZFS will just ignore it and write it asynchronously like normal. That can definitely be a speed improvement. The downside is that it means that a bunch of writes that the database asks to be guaranteed are just sitting in RAM and haven't been flushed to the disks, and they only get flushed like every 5 seconds, meaning that if the server were to crash, you would lose that 5 or 10 seconds of data. Now, not a big deal on a bulk import because you'll probably just start it over. But on your live database, that would be really bad. Although the upside is that unlike another file system, ZFS will at least have the database look like it did 5 or 10 seconds ago.
It's still consistent,
where the data file is half overwritten and it's full of gibberish. You can also set the log bias to throughput, and that will, instead of latency, and that will skip going through the ZIL if you have one. Although, again, matters less if sync is disabled. And again, you probably don't want that most of the time. But it is a way for you to tell ZFS to, for this particular data set, don't use the ZIL. Normally, you wouldn't want to do that for your database. But, if it's a bulk import, then it might be useful to you.
Okay. Very cool. Yeah. Definitely remember to reset some of those options when you're done. Okay. So next up, of course, there's a lot of databases to choose from, but of course, Postgres has always had a special place on FreeBSD. So today we have a look at a kind of a getting started guide for those taking the plunge and maybe using Postgres for the first time. So naturally, getting started is going to look somewhat familiar to many. If you've already done some FreeBSD work before, you'll see package commands and sysrc. So basically installing things and turning them on. All easy peasy stuff. You can handle that. So after starting the service, though, with, of course, the service command, you'll be ready to actually start setting up your Postgres instance. So just a couple things. This is where it differs maybe from setting up MySQL or whatever. You'll need to go ahead and create your initial user password combo, and it has some instructions on how you'll do that. There's a Postgres user created by default that you'll SU over to and do that there. And then there's a database with which you'll want to give grant access for that particular user to talk to your initial database. So once you've done that, it's pretty much good to go. But one thing you do need to note is by default, remote access is disabled on the database server. So if you're going to be hosting something that lives offsite or not on the same box, you'll need to make some adjustments to one of the conf files, which allows other IPs outside to connect. So that's important to keep note of. But if you're doing something like a WordPress stack or something and it all lives on the same box and it's talking to itself on the local host, you're good to go. So pay attention to that. I think, though, if you run into jail, you'll need to turn on the remote access, though, as well, because that's still talking to another IP address. Right. So keep that in mind if you're throwing this into, if you have your database jailed in one place and then you're running Nginx in another jail, you'll need to pay attention to that. But at that point, you're pretty much good to go. So if this is your first rodeo, maybe start with something easy. There's tons of tutorials out there that show you how to set up like Apache with WordPress or Nginx with WordPress. I would try some of those out. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. It's not all that difficult to get spun up with Postgres on a FreeBSD box. Okay, heading into the news roundup. So we have some OpenBSD VMM hypervisor test drives that have been done. Looks like some YouTube videos. Yeah. So Alan, tell us about this.
The other week when VMM got added to the base system on OpenBSD, we were like, it'd be great if somebody tried this out and kind of let us know how it went. So that's what's happened here. They've made a video of about 11 minutes of them playing with VMM. The first thing I noticed is the command line interface for VMM, which is called VMCTL, looks quite easy to use. It takes an approach that looks much closer to some of the Beehive management frameworks rather than, Beehive's confusing set of switches. It's got a, VMM console ID and it just fires up Q for you and a bunch of things like that. And then it has a config file that actually looks a lot like the one I originally designed for Beehive, but was superseded when Beehive grew a bunch of new features that ended up with the config file need to look different. But very nice, straightforward looking config file that, while it's not written as UCL, it looks like it would actually parse perfectly as UCL, which is also very nice. So yeah, quite interesting. Goes through and shows, some VMs you already created and just accessing the console, and then showing how you could do with SSH instead. Configuring the network in a VM, showing how it uses VIO and what the different device names are and so on. And then as the third part, actually builds a fresh VM and does a install of OpenBSD in it to show how that works. Okay. Currently, VMM only supports running OpenBSD VMs. You can't run any other OSs on it yet, but I imagine that.
Is there a certain like version that you can go back to running OpenBSD?
I'm not sure how far you can go back running it in there. I think all the supported versions, because they've had VirtIO for a while.
Okay.
But it's only available in the newest snapshots, and it will be in the next release. But if you can grab a snapshot from, I think, October 22nd or later, then it'll have VMM, and you can give it a test drive.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so next up we have FreeBSD Foundation has an October 2016 update for us, which is amazing. November's already here. Holidays are just around the corner, but we didn't want to let this one get lost in all the noise as we get busy at the end of the year here. But before they get into the stories, I wanted to first tell you they do provide a helpful list of upcoming conferences for the fall and winter, which includes some of the UNIX gatherings. Of course, there's the Developer Summit for FreeBSD, which takes place next week along with MeetBSD. So again, last reminder, I promise, you should be out at that. So you still have a week. Try and get out to that. Me and Alan will both be there. But then the next up, the Foundation, of course, gives us a quick hardware update initially, discussing some of the new ThunderX Cavium servers, which they've deployed, which are ARM v8 64-bit. And yes, I am drooling a little bit. They also mentioned that the work is ongoing for the Raspberry Pi 3 platform and Pine 64 as well. So definitely some ARM stuff up at the top of the article this time. Also, we have GNN, who's been on the show a couple times here, has an article reprinted from the FreeBSD Journal talking about the achievement of making it all the way to 11.0 over the span of 23 years now. Wow, hard to believe. 23 years of FreeBSD. Of course, he mentions that the foundation is open to all and welcomes donations to continue to keep up this tradition of good work being done, and mentions some of the things that enables. Deb Goodkin over at the Foundation also gives us an update on the Grace Hopper Convention that took place in Houston, Texas several weeks back. They said roughly 14,000 women in tech attended, which is a huge turnout, and FreeBSD was well represented there. They have some pictures of the booth.
Yep, there's Dan and Deb and Groff. And
yeah, that sounds neat. I think Drew went to that, but looks good. So next up, they have a call to potential speakers, and they remind you, don't forget that there's plenty of places you can help present about FreeBSD, not just at BSD-centered conferences, but there's conferences like Scale in Los Angeles and conferences, Linux conferences all around the world, other technical conferences, and FreeBSD, I think, would be good to be represented there. So if that's something where you could potentially, a lot of these are all around the world, so you might find one that's either in your hometown or close to it, and you could drive to it. Put in for a talk. A lot of times they will, just speaking from personal experience, a lot of times they'll accept you just because they don't have a lot of FreeBSD talks to get submitted.
They're like,
so that's kind of unique.
Some more diversity in what the topics yeah, I think there's a good chance you could make a bigger impact by presenting about FreeBSD at a non-BSD conference than necessarily at a BSD conference.
Correct. A lot of times at the BSD conferences, you're kind of preaching to the converted already, maybe letting us know about cool new things or more technical things on the BSD side. But at a Linux conference, that may be their first exposure to FreeBSD or hearing about things like jails or how ZFS works on it and stuff. So you can actually, I know a lot of people have given kind of general introduction to FreeBSD talks or FreeNAS, for example, or we've done PCBSD talks, etc. So those are usually very well received. So I myself would encourage you to do that as well. If that's something you have a little time and you can donate a little bit of that time to helping the effort.
Especially talks kind of along the lines of, jails for Docker users or something like that to try basically, especially if you are a Linux to BSD convert yourself, helping bridge that gap for more people.
Yep, that's definitely good stuff. Of course, as they wrap up in the article here, they talk about EuroBSDCon. Give us a little bit of an overview how that went. Again, Deb wrote this one from the foundation. It includes a list of some of those recognized for their contributions to FreeBSD as well, which is good to see. But all in all, it looks like a good conference. I know, Alan, you've told us all about it, so definitely a fun one, and I'm glad you guys all enjoyed that. Okay, time for our second sponsor this week. So we're going to be doing DigitalOcean now, digitalocean.com. And you've been there before, or if you haven't, shame on you. You should go check it out. Me and Alan both have droplets that we run for various things. Of course, we use FreeBSD in our droplets because why would we not? But anyway, they offer all kinds of stuff. So if you want to run different Linux distros, you could do that. Of course, FreeBSD is available out of box, and they have 11.0 now. They have ZFS. The nice thing is it doesn't have to be FreeBSD. So if you're an OpenFan or Dragonfly or Net, there's ways to do that as well. Just look it up. They have a nice console. There's several guides floating around out there how to change the version of the operating system that's in your virtual droplet there. But the nice thing about DigitalOcean is they make it so easy. It's literally a couple clicks, wait about 50, 55 seconds or so, and boom, you have a new VM ready to go. You can SSH into it, and you are set. And of course, we can't neglect to mention the coupon code FreeBSDNow. So if this is your first time and you're just making an account, go ahead and apply that coupon code FreeBSDNow, and that'll give you your $10 credit, which is good for running the lowest end VM for a couple months, or if you want to use it to pay for part of one of the higher end VMs so you have more RAM, that's fine too. But of course, everything's still backed by SSDs, so you're still going to get really good disk performance either way. And of course, locations all over the world, which we've mentioned as well. So if you need something really close to home for low latency, you can do that. If you're maybe wanting to send data far, far away, so you have something very off-site. So for example, when the earthquake wipes out the entire California coast, you have a copy of your data somewhere else, like that's a good thing too. Right? I think, Alan, you said that's where your status page lives. So if your services ever go down, you have some sort of off-site location.
Exactly. So, and now that they have the SSD-based block storage, you can rent storage for said backups at just exactly the number of gigabytes you need, rather than having to get a bigger droplet instance or whatever. Yeah.
Which is definitely cool. So it's neat that they've just kind of made all these things super simple and easy. So check it out today. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Take a look at their website and just kind of look at all the cool stuff you can do. Don't forget to check out their API, though, too. If you need to programmatically do this, they make that easy.
They do.
Okay, so what's this next thing we have here? AdHoku?
Yes, AdHoku.
What is this?
So it's a toy single-host platform as a service built on FreeBSD, Jails, and Ansible.
Okay.
So it's based on the concept of Doku, which is basically the same thing for Linux powered by Docker, but this uses Ansible and Jails on FreeBSD to do it instead. When you deploy an application using a Doku, it creates a new jail on the remote host and provisions it with a fixed clean state using the instructions from the jail file, which is basically just a shell script that it gets from your Git repository. All the jails sit behind a reverse proxy that directs traffic to one of them based on the domain name or IP address of the HTTP request. So you can have multiple jails for basically one for each website, and then the Nginx on the host machine or whatever will actually make sure the request gets to the right jail. So you only need one IP address this way. So it's a great way to run multiple websites on it, say a DigitalOcean droplet where you have just the one IP address. When a new jail has been provisioned for an application, it will seamlessly reconfigure the reverse proxy to send the traffic to the newer active version of that application. So if you just follow the instructions on how to get a Doku with an example application running on your VM in your development environment, it even has a Vagrant setup for you. So even if you've never used FreeBSD before, it's like Vagrant up on your with a Vagrant file that sets up FreeBSD, and then you set up this Doku thing, and all of a sudden you have a FreeBSD server running your application, and you didn't have to do anything.
Yeah, that sounds too easy.
Yeah, they say the process requires no FreeBSD specific knowledge, although if you wanted to modify the jail file to customize it a bit, that might require a little bit. But it seems like an interesting project, and I like kind of based on that the suggestion for a title for a talk earlier. It's nice to see people working on workflows so that people who have only ever used Docker on Linux or whatever can have an easier time switching over and trying FreeBSD by just, here's my application. Like if you're running a standard web stack, whether it's Python or Ruby or PHP or whatever, deploying it with FreeBSD jails as your containers or whatever. It's like, Nginx is the same thing. Python is the same thing. It's just the OS underneath gets out of the way better now.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely good stuff. Lowering that barrier to entry for newcomers. This is a good way to get them hooked.
You get them using it a little bit, and then they'll learn more. Whereas if you make them learn first, they're not going to be as interested.
Yeah, they're like, I lost patience with that and moved on.
There's also an interesting link at the bottom here for Docker-like functionality for EasyJail. We might have to look into that on a future episode.
Yeah, we'll have to take a look at that. Okay, speaking of easy, so how about OpenBSD on a laptop? Is that difficult? Well, not hardly. We have a great walkthrough today by Keith Burnett, which just demonstrates how easy it can be to get up and running with an XFCE desktop on a fresh OpenBSD installation. So beforehand, for those curious, he did all this with a ThinkPad X60, 120 gigabyte SSD, and he was using OpenBSD 6.0. So now that all the prerequisites are out of the way. He doesn't actually cover the install process itself. He has a link, though. He says that's covered by everything in the OpenBSD FAQ pages. So as long as you can hit enter and do that a couple times, you should be good to go. He said, however, once the system is up and running, though, we start with the most important portion, which, of course, is getting working internet access via the Wi-Fi of the laptop. So really, it's just a couple ifconfig commands later, and we're in business. It's just scanning, figuring out what device it is, setting it up, and so forth. And once you have an IP address, step 2 he takes us to is getting the package configuration going. As an aside, I've never really understood why this is still a thing that you have to do, but no fret, it's actually really easy to do on OpenBSD, so it's not tough. Maybe one of these days they'll just ship those options or something. Or
because they want you
ask.
to pick a mirror.
Yeah, but maybe I would make it part of the installer or something, like make it part of the installation process where you can just hit enter or something like, yeah, I'll take the default or I'll pick one here. But anyway, that's an aside. Even so, don't let that daunt you. It's actually not that bad. With package repos available, though, now you can grab the binaries for XFCE and friends with just a few simple package add commands. So again, easy peasy so far. And steps 4 through 6 are some of the specific bits you need to do to enable XFCE services for handy things such as setting do as permissions so you can do USB mounting. So why is that important? Well, if you want to use XFCE's graphical mount and unmount utilities, that's running as a user. So you need a USB mounting working as a user. So you'll want to go ahead and set that up, and that's a pretty convenient thing. Lastly, he talks about, though, keeping the system updated. Of course, that's important. So he has a nice tutorial on how to do that, along with links to a handy open up script, which takes most of the guesswork out of it. Again, almost too simple at this point. You just fetch the script and run that, and it kind of does its thing. And as a bonus, there's steps for doing a full disk encrypted install are also included, which isn't for everyone, but you may want it if you're paranoid like many people are and should be. So definitely check that out. And at the end of the day, you end up with a really nice XFCE-enabled OpenBSD laptop and an easy way to keep it up to date. So definitely a good tutorial. It sounds like maybe you could do all this in 10-15 minutes if you just follow along pretty closely. It's not that big a deal. Okay, time to hit into the beastie bits. So we have a few things to bring your way, and then, of course, we'll get to your feedback and questions in a moment. But first up, we have GNN posted a little post to Twitter with a picture showing PyTop running on a Raspberry Pi 3 with FreeBSD head. I don't know, can you show that off on the screen there, Alan? Okay, good deal, good deal. That looks neat. I like the little laptop case. Is that like a thing you can buy called the PyTop?
Apparently, and I guess I think a keyboard normally slots in right over top of that. I'm not entirely sure.
That's what the circuit board on the left is probably, right? That's your power. Maybe that's where you run the cables around from the Pi that powers the keyboard and stuff, I would guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's a USB hub, and it looks like there's an internal HDMI cable that goes from the Pi to that then powers the screen.
Okay. That's pretty cool, though. It's a neat little device, and then you can actually upgrade your laptop, I assume, when the newer Pis come out. You could just slot the new one in there, and boom, laptop upgrade.
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
That's pretty slick.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty slick. It's running the RaspBSD that Brad Davis does.
Okay. Very nice. So you guys, I need a better, just as an aside. So for other TrueOS projects where we're doing some Raspberry Pi stuff, we need a better frame buffer driver. Like we need to port over FB Turbo or something from Linux, which will hopefully make it a little better. Let's see. JT's saying that's the HDMI to LVDS adapter board that we're seeing there. Okay, very cool. Nice stuff. Well, anyway, that's really cool, and hopefully we'll see more Raspberry Pi stuff like Raspberry Pi 3 stuff like this showing up here in the near future. I'm waiting for that SMP support and frame buffer. Okay, so next up we have a NetBSD 7.0.2 has been released, and it's a smaller update, a lot of security fixes. It looks like the race condition in mail.local, which we talked about a while back, that made it in. Some OpenSSL updates, NTP, bind has been updated, some X window errors, and then they've fixed some different crashes, it looks like an NFS crash, a PMAP fix for MIPS, fix an issue with UFS1 file systems that are created outside of NetBSD. Okay. Yeah, I wonder who ran into that. So, and some Spark 64 fixes. Woo! So good stuff. But anyway, you might want to go ahead and get your NetBSD update to get all those security fixes on your system. Okay, so next we have a Dragonfly. We have a link to a Git commit here. It looks like kernel where they've fixed some MMC SD card read-write issues as well. I think Dylan's the one who did this one. I'm just bringing it up now. Yep. So he says, B, res ID was not being set to 0 on a successful read or write, resulting in random short read or short write returns for requests. Oh, that's not good. He said fixing this fixes nominal block IO via the MMSD disk device. He fixed some TS sleep stuff, so it uses that instead of delay for the 10 millisecond pause and request command wait loops. And he reduced the timeout from 10 seconds to 1 second after the first timeout, only increasing it back to 10 seconds when the timeouts stop occurring. So he said this reduces boot time delays when an MMC port is dead or powered down. Good stuff. Okay.
Yeah, it makes sense to wait 10 seconds the first time, but if you're going to retry 5 times, waiting 10 seconds every time is probably a waste.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Okay. And then this last one's kind of neat. So the Enigma machine, if you've heard of that or if you don't know what that is, go look up your World War II history. But we have a GitHub project which creates a char device or a character device on FreeBSD and Linux, which implements the Enigma machine. So that's actually kind of cool. Somebody's going to have to include that in their product as an Easter egg or whatever. But anyway, you have to take a look at that. Maybe some of you crypto nerds out there will want to mess around with this. This is a good... This would be a good school project or something. I could see a professor assigning this or whatever. Like, you need to get the Enigma going. But anyway, check it out today. We have the link for you in the show notes here. Okay, so time for our last sponsor this week, which is going to be Tarsnap. Website for that, of course, is tarsnap.com/BSDNow. You want to go there today, get signed up, start doing your backups securely, safely, and offsite the way they should be done. That's what me and Alan are using here for a lot of our important data. And, of course, Tarsnap makes it super simple and cheap. We have to stress that because it's only sending the data that's changed. So once you've backed up, say, your couple hundred megs of data or whatever it is, you're only going to back up the bits that have changed at that point. Yep. So it makes the cost really low.
It means doing a backup of the code you wrote at a conference, only going to use, kilobytes or whatever, and it's not going to take forever on the slow Wi-Fi at the hotel.
Yeah, for sure. But of course, Tarsnap, the other nice thing about it is, you've heard me and Alan talk about this, but the encryption side of it, they encrypt everything, but it's done in the proper way where you're the only one who actually has access to your keys. So you don't have to worry about somebody on the remote side, looking through your data or snooping or being forced to turn it over, a hacker getting in and compromising the entire system. No, each person's data is encrypted with a unique key, which you have on your side. So if you want your data to go away, you can just get rid of the key. RMRF it, shred the paper you printed out, whatever, and get rid of it. And then even if the data has been copied a gazillion times up in the cloud and sitting on backup tapes and cold storage, it's still rendered meaningless because the key to decrypt it is gone.
When Colin designed this, he wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to get arrested and tortured to get the crypto keys out of him by making sure that it's easy to prove that he just doesn't have the crypto keys.
That's right. And the nice thing is Tarsnap provides the source code for you. So you don't have to trust Colin. You don't have to trust me. You don't have to trust Alan. Go look at it yourself. Get your favorite crypto guy and your Unix experts or whoever to just kind of pour through the source code, verify it's doing exactly what it claims to. If you find a bug, let them know. They pay bug bounties, which is kind of cool. Not a lot of products out there will offer that, but it's definitely solid stuff. So you should be doing your backups today. Get started. Okay, so let's go right here to feedback and questions. Yes. We have Matt first, who says, Alan and Chris, I have a question about server monitoring. What do you guys currently use for monitoring all your servers? Alan, I have heard you talk about Nagios before. Are there any tutorials or how-tos on how to get it monitoring on a FreeNAS server? I want to monitor CPU, RAM, disk, etc. I'm comfortable on the command line SSH, just want to do it correctly. Thanks in advance. Love all the things you guys contribute to the community. Well, I'll answer first because I don't use Nagios. Actually, I don't run enough servers to, I guess, set it up yet. We have IT people at iHex Systems who manage all the website infrastructure and whatnot, but all I have to watch is a couple of my personal boxes at the house, which isn't so bad. So anyway, Alan, what are you doing on your side? You have obviously more you're responsible for.
So we use Nagios. Currently, we monitor, as it loads here, about 200 hosts with just shy of 4,000 services spread across them. Because we monitor quite a few things, especially on rented machines. We monitor the bandwidth quota. Has this server used up its amount for the month, so that our load balancer takes that into consideration and make sure not to use more than the 10 terabytes that are included with the server or whatever. We monitor CPU temperature, how busy the CPU is in two different ways. We do one that's just percent idle, and then another one that's actually monitoring what percent is like user, nice, system, etc.
Sure.
Mostly the point of those two is to graph them so that, when I get an alert saying, oh, this server is using too much CPU or whatever, I can look at the graph and see, like, did that start all of a sudden, or has it been building slowly for a week, or what's the pattern there? But, we monitor how much disk space is free, how the megabytes per second of writes to each of the disk, so that, basically if a lot of data is being written to the disk will be slow. So we monitor that. Monitoring the ping to the server so we know what the latency is. And all of a sudden, if a server seems slow, we can look and it's like, oh, well, yeah, it's now also taking, 30 milliseconds longer to reply to pings. So that's probably abnormal. Load average, amount of memory free, how busy the network card is the web server working, NTP time offset. Is the clock right? Currently, the random one I'm looking at here is slow by 0.00236 seconds. So that's good. How many processes are running, right? If that gets into too many hundreds, then that's probably abnormal. Is our orchestration system up to date, or is it falling behind? For the PCBSD package repo, monitoring now is like, how old is this replication? Sure. And if it gets more than a couple hours, we get alerts going off, so we know that edge is having problems. The uptime, mostly just so that, it's obvious when something reboots, and a couple other things, and obviously Zpool health. But almost all of those are just done with net SNMP. So we just run the SNMP, configure it so that only our server is allowed to connect to it and authenticate, and pull that data into Nagios. And then the rest of them we do passive submission to Nagios because there's less load on the Nagios server that way. And it's, in some of the cases, our custom check for the PCBSD package repo is run on each server, and it just submits its results because it's basically running a shell script that outputs whether it's good or not, and then submit that result to Nagios. People like Asinga. It's basically started as a fork of Nagios, but then they rewrote the whole thing. But it's the plugins are still compatible. So all your Nagios plugins that you might be using, or that are basically already available that everybody uses, will work with it. But it's apparently a nicer monitoring system than Nagios. For us, it's mostly Nagios because that's what we were using, and it was working, and we just kept adding to it.
Sure.
It's working well enough for us, but it uses quite a bit of the CPU on a rather big server at the moment. But we are monitoring 4,000 services across 200 hosts.
Wow.
When you have like 8 machines, it's probably not going to be a big deal.
Yeah.
And again, if you just have a FreeNAS at home, you probably don't want to set up a separate Nagios just to monitor it. It really depends what you're trying to do.
Well, FreeNAS is pretty good. It has its own alert UI, so if you just log in periodically, you can look at that. It sends you emails, so that's an important thing. A lot of people mess on the FreeNAS side, just they don't put an email address in there. Enable that, it'll email you when it's starting scrubs and when it's checking things. And when it finds problems, like that's kind of a good first step.
Yep.
Okay, well, hope that helped you out. Next up, we have Tony who says, hey, just wanted to say good job on the show. Keep it up. Started watching a few months ago as my desire to drift from Windows as my main home OS becomes more entrenched due to the update issues in Windows 10. As a prime example, while updating Visual Studio recently, the machine restarted itself to complete the update without my permission. Ouch. Said really bad form, but thankfully I didn't lose much work. Linux has been fine on the whole as my laptop OS, but the more stable and centered design philosophy of FreeBSD or TrueOS might be the winning argument. I'm looking forward to 11.0. He said I resisted downloading it until it's on the main site for download, as hopefully it will play more nicely with my Broadwell-based laptop than 10.3 or PCBSD 10.3 does. Yeah, if you grab the newer PCBSD images, you should have better luck with the video drivers there. He says, I'll slip into a question for the show here, though. I didn't hear it come up last week. He said, LLVM and the proposed change to the Apache license. He said, I gather OpenBSD is going to drop the toolchain if this happens. Will this affect FreeBSD or TrueOS too? Actually, that's the first I had heard that OpenBSD had an issue with it.
Well, OpenBSD hasn't switched to it. So they just
I don't know how they're dropping it. Right.
But no, FreeBSD already has, we've also accepted the CDDL that OpenBSD doesn't. And, the Apache license is pretty straightforward. It's basically the BSD license with a patent grant to avoid getting sued. It's a rather popular license, and I wouldn't, FreeBSD doesn't expect to have any trouble with it or any problems.
Yeah. It's not a deal breaker.
Also, it's not clear that LLVM will change its license or that it will be able to. Which is part of the thing that I think the email from Theo that the Tony's referring to was, how can they go and just change the license like that? Because you'd have to get the permission of every person who's ever contributed anything to be able to do that. It's a really difficult thing to do, unless the code was written by one person or all, copyright assigned to one company or something. But it's not with LLVM, so...
Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question. No worries here. I know on the TrueOS side, it's like a no big deal. So anyway, we'll see what happens. Okay, so next up is Ben. He said, hi, both. About a year ago, I first installed FreeBSD on my T440. It was soon after that I discovered BSD Now, and I've listened every week since then. My personal servers all used to run Linux, but now are all FreeBSD. Thanks to Jails, 5 servers have been consolidated into 2. Well, that's cool. Saving yourself a little power, too. Said, I've even managed to get FreeNAS deployed at work in my small test environment. Said, you and your guests have kept me captivated week after week and helped take me from nothing to being an everyday FreeBSD user. In the last few months, you've encouraged me to look at port maintenance, and I've had 2 ports committed thanks to a couple very helpful people within the community. A quick note to say that it's not let me reread that. A quick note to say that's not much being much of a programmer. Blah. Sorry.
Saying that not being much of a programmer, ports is not hard.
Yeah. Yeah, he said, I thought porting would be massively difficult, but it's not actually that bad thanks to the Porter's Handbook and helpful community members. Yeah. He said, I'm mainly writing to say both thank you and a massive thanks to the community. But I do have a quick question for you both. Should I want to confirm how old a FreeBSD installation is, how is it best to achieve that? My laptop has been running 11 current and was having world and kernel rebuilt every week. Recently, it's been running 11 stable, having simply switched SVN paths at the appropriate time. So I've not done any fresh install, just source-based upgrades. Thank you again so much for the show, and here's to another year. So FreeBSD version is the first thing you can do.
Yeah, well,
see what that tells
it depends which thing you want to know. Do you want to know what you're currently running? Then uname -a will have the date that the kernel was built, although that'll be when you built 11 stable or whatever. I think that what he actually wants is if you do stat/, it will tell you can find the birth time, the creation date of your / directory. And that will be when you actually last formatted the disk, which I think is what he actually meant. If you want to know the date that he first installed FreeBSD on his laptop or whatever, then you could do that. I think looking at the machine I'm sitting in front of that SSH2 right now, looks like its / was created October 15th, 2013.
I'll have to try that on a couple of my home boxes.
Yeah. Also, if it's ZFS, there is a creation or created property. So if you do zpool get created on your pool name, it's creation.
See, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work for me because I've done hardware upgrades in my system and done life preserver restores, which recreated the zpool. Well, I would assume that wouldn't preserve that info. Well, that stinks because my main desktop I've been running like PCBSD 8 on it. I've been upgrading it the whole way, but yeah, there's definitely been some hardware switches.
Yeah, like my very first ZFS pool was created Monday, November 28th, 2011.
Okay.
That was hard to believe I started with ZFS only that long ago, but also it's been 5 years now.
Yeah, I know, right? And you have a book now.
2.
What the heck? 2. A lot has happened in 5 years. Okay, well, thanks for writing, Ben.
But yeah, so
hopefully
ZFS get creation and then the name of your pool will give you the creation date of the root of your pool, which should also match the creation date of slash. Although, with boot environments, that slash might be a different data set. But anyway,
sure. Okay, so next up we have David who says, "Hi, Chris and Alan. Let me first say every week I'm really enjoying your show. I would like to build a NAS server under FreeBSD and ZFS to avoid set up wrongly the hard drive. I wish to understand how ZFS deals with the internal write cache that some hard drives have, like the Western Digital Reds. Is it necessary to turn them off, for example, in the case of power failure? If yes, how can this be turned off?" I don't think you need to turn them off.
Right. So ZFS ensures that it's always consistent, so you'll always be able to do that. The bigger thing is it depends if the drive's cache lies or not. So ZFS will do certain things, and after it's done a transaction group, it will ask the hard drive, "Please flush your cache and make sure everything I've written so far is actually on disk, and tell me when you're done." And ZFS will only continue once that's done. Usually the drives don't lie, but some controllers will lie to try to get more performance. In that case, you want to do that. You want to turn that off on the controller. But if you're just doing regular SATA hard drives, it's fine.
Sure.
The worst case, if your server, if the power goes out or whatever, stuff that was written in the last 5 seconds might not show up. But usually that's not a problem.
Okay. Cool. So next up we have
asking if there is a way to help with the organization of EuroBSDCon next year. Because it's in Paris,
I missed that.
And that's where he lives. You can definitely get in touch with the EuroBSDCon Foundation and offer your services as a volunteer. I'm sure they can put you to good use.
Yeah, sorry about that. I completely messed that last PS at the bottom there. Thanks for asking, David. Hopefully we'll see you there next year. Okay, so Charles writes in last. He says, "Hey guys, I've been using FreeBSD 11.0 RCs for a while now, and the one thing I'm having trouble with is making fonts smooth and anti-aliased when I'm using a window manager like i3 or Window Maker. I have XFCE and Mate installed for comparison, and text in Firefox and Chrome looks very nice when I'm using either of them versus when I'm using i3 or WMaker. He said, I've followed this guide to the letter, and he links us to the handbook about X fonts. He says, in all cases, I have Compton running in the background. He said, what's the magic to make fonts smooth in older window managers that aren't using GNOME or KDE? So a couple things. I'll just give you a few hints here on TrueOS. We've had to mess with this over the years too. But in user local etc fonts, you'll have your local.conf file. You may want to just go pull that out of one of our TrueOS Git repos if you want to copy ours and then modify from there. That helps a lot. That turns on things like the anti-aliasing and whatnot to make fonts look prettier and smoother and all that jazz. Matter of fact, I have one here. Let me see if there was anything specific. It's a pretty long file. A number of people over the years have come by and dropped in fixes and turned on hinting and other stuff. So I don't even remember the last time I've had to touch this, but the defaults we have work pretty good on a lot of different window managers. So I would just rip that off. There's nothing specific to it that means you couldn't use it on FreeBSD. Also, having good fonts helps a lot too. So we've started using the Noto fonts, and we've found those look really good in Firefox with using this font config. Anything you want to add to that, Alan? Or?
No, I know nothing about
not a font guy.
and X.
Honestly, I'm not a huge font guy either. Personally, I hate touching fonts because every time I make a change or anybody does, there's immediately pushback, right? Because everyone has an opinion on how it should look, and it's never quite right for you. It's always, I want it this way or I want it that way. So fonts I just hate touching in general because I'm always going to do it wrong. And I'm, I guess, not picky enough. A lot more people are a lot more sensitive to fonts than I am. But anyway, hopefully that's helpful for you. Ours, again, people have been adding to it for years, and it seems to be at a pretty consistent state where a lot of people like what it looks like. So grab that, and hopefully that helps you out.
Yep.
Okay, so that pretty much wraps up this week's show. So we're going to, of course, remind you to send everything into feedback@bsdnow.tv. And by everything, I mean everything. So if you have questions, comments, show ideas, if you have a topic, something you want us to discuss, or stories you want mentioned on the show, send it to feedback@bsdnow.tv. That's the only place we really can monitor. So both me, Alan, and JT will see that. Twitter's fine. Sometimes we're on Twitter. I don't know. I'm actually really bad about social media, so I apologize for that if folks have tried to send me stuff on Twitter. But feedback@bsdnow.tv is definitely the one place where we'll all get it and take a look at it, and may not respond right away, but we'll try and work it into a future episode. We're starting to get caught up on some of the backlog finally of emails that have been sent in. So keep sending it in, and we would appreciate that. And of course, we'll see you same time next week with another episode, which you won't want to miss.